think it's important for him to also bolster the roles of our diplomats while he's over there, and to make that clear to our allies that we're working on all cylinders to make sure the military option is our last option. I don't want to sound too dovish, but I just had to throw that in there.
It seems that this president believes that the most powerful form of diplomacy is making
Twitter
sure
diplomacy?
that the enemy is making sure that the opposition, in this case, believes that you would take military action. And there you have President Donald Trump and the First Lady, Melania Trump, just arriving as they get off Air Force One here in Honolulu to begin what Mark pointed out is going to be the longest presidential trip of this kind that we have seen in a very long time. They will be here this evening. They will visit the USS Arizona overnight tonight. And obviously, as we mentioned, they're going to have the PACOM briefing. He will this afternoon. But this is a very significant way, as we have mentioned, to begin this trip, to begin it in Hawaii, which looks out over this very potentially dangerous part of the world, and a part that he will visit where he'll try to shore up relations with our allies, with Japan, with South Korea. He will visit Vietnam. He will visit the Philippines as well. And there you see the traditional receiving of the leis as they arrive in Hawaii, and a hug for Melania Trump as she has begun this part of the trip too, standing by the president's side throughout the course of this. Let me go back to you, Mark, as we watch all of this. You have been part of these trips in the Bush White House. You know, what goes through your mind as you watch this president, still fairly new at the job, not a year in, begin this very historic journey?
I just think the stakes are so high. I've been on that plane landing on that airport with President Bush traveling to that part of the world, and with Secretary Rumsfeld. But the stakes have never been higher for an American president traveling to Asia, because, as I indicated earlier, we've run out of road to kick the can down on North Korea, and this is our one chance to rally the world towards some sort of a solution short of the total war that the general laid out. So the stakes on this trip are incredibly high, and I hope that Admiral Harris and some of the commanders at PACOM there are going to be giving him a set of military options short of total war. For example, you alluded to, I had suggested that the president could declare a no-fly zone over the Korean Peninsula. No ballistic missiles will be allowed to launch from the Korean Peninsula. We'll take them down either with ballistic missile defenses, or we'll take them out on the launch pad. And just as declaratory policy and reassurance to the Korean regime that if they don't retaliate, we're not going to go for regime change right away. And so therefore they have to make a choice. Do they want the regime to be destroyed by retaliating or not? This would be something similar to what the Israelis did with the nuclear program in Syria, where they took out the North Korean-built nuclear plant in Syria, and the Syrians did nothing in response. So I think we need to try a lot of options to make sure that that include military to stop this thing in its tracks before we get to. And I would also send the seriousness that if they do keep going, we will take them out, as the general laid out.
Yeah, great point. Jessica, one of the tricky things, obviously, about dealing with China is the president's long-held feelings about the unfair trade practices that he believes that they participate in. So he wants to press them on that. He wants to press them on the issue of their aggressiveness in the expansion in the South China Seas, building islands in order to expand their military base in that area. At the same time, he would like to improve trade relations. He decided not to do the TPP, which will be met with some criticism in some of the countries that he's visiting, and he wants to do a lot of bilateral trade agreements where it's just one-on-one, and that's why you see a whole series of these kinds of meetings set up here with regard to trade. Your thoughts on all that?
My thoughts are, I thought it was very illuminating in an interview earlier this week, or maybe last week, that he said that President Xi was like King Xi of China, that he's very clear about how much power he wields and in the region generally. And I think he really sees it as a meeting of two kings, as it were, the Western world and the Eastern world there. I hope that he goes in with very clear policies that he wants enacted, especially in terms of trade, since he's going to be going after bilateral agreements there, and that he's just as direct as possible. It would be great for there to be some hard resolutions that come out of this, instead of kind of waffle talk around these issues, and it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what President Xi is willing to compromise on and how he views all of this. There have been a lot of talks in the foreign policy community right now about how this is essentially President Xi's world at this point, and that he's amassing more and more power, as you said, expanding into the South and East China Sea, taking over land that Japan sees as their own, and obviously Japan, one of our closest allies. So it'll be interesting to see, for me, really, if there are any resolutions that come out of this, and what are the policies that President Trump actually advocates for when he's sitting, face to face with President Xi.
Yeah, and you can't really underestimate the importance of sitting face to face with these leaders. And as you just pointed out, the leaders in South Korea and also in Japan, Prime Minister Abe, are going to be looking for that reassurance, because they do not 100%. Want China, obviously, to dominate the seas around that area. So they're going to be looking for some reassurance from the president. General Tata, there has been some discussion over the past 24, 36 hours about the possibility that North Korea could test a missile during this trip. What do you think about the possibility of that?
Well, yeah, I think it's highly possible. It depends on where they shoot it, where it lands, and ultimately how provocative they want to be. But it would be a hugely stupid thing for Kim Jong-un to do, and it would be a finger in the president's eye. And I was getting ready to mention that my biggest concern about these parallel converging railroad tracks that us and North Korea are on is a mistake that could be made, and that would be a mistake that could be made that could ultimately lead to a more emotional rather than rational response, or either way, we need to be able to look at that, and I am sure that is one of the contingencies that has been laid out. If they shoot, what is our flexible response option? We have, as was being laid out earlier, we have flexible deterrent options, flexible response options. We could move Rangers onto the Korean Peninsula. We could fly more B-1 bombers. We've got 3 carrier strike groups in the sea right there off the Korean Peninsula. It is right now we are prepped militarily to attack North Korea, and if they were to launch while the president is boots on the ground in South Korea, that would be a huge mistake that could spark the forest fire, so to speak, that starts this thing. And I really think that we need to be. I'm sure that they've thought through this. The planners have, H.R. McMaster, and so forth.
It's a great point. It's a great point. Spending some time in the Pearl Harbor Museum yesterday, and you look at the images there and the efforts that were made at diplomacy right before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, up to the final hours before they attacked Pearl Harbor, and you had sort of 2 streams that weren't talking to each other in Japan, and the military attack was already underway while those diplomatic efforts were being sought. And it just gives you, Mark, that sense of the reality of what happens in an emotional moment. Not that that was a particularly emotional moment, it was clearly planned, but how easy it is when you look across the course of history to slip into war when there are mixed messages or diplomacy fails.
And it's a reminder. I mean, the general was talking about miscalculations. I mean, the dictators are prone to miscalculate. One of the problems that we have is that we can't count on Kim Jong-un to behave as a rational actor. I mean, he's acting rationally for his interests, but there's no debate within the North Korean regime about strategy. If you walk into Kim Jong-un's office and say, "Dear leader, I think you're making a big mistake testing this missile while Donald Trump is on the Korean Peninsula," you're going to find yourself on the receiving end of an artillery barrage. People are terrified. So people don't go up to the leader and say, "You're making a mistake, you ought to really reconsider," because they're afraid that they're going to get purged. This is one of the reasons why we had a war in Iraq, was that Saddam Hussein, if he had no weapons of mass destruction stockpiles, all he had to do was let the inspectors come in and say, "Here, you got free reign, there's nothing here, you can look anywhere you want," and there would have been no war. So we can't count on these dictators to make rational decisions, rational in terms of how we see the world. And then you've got the added problem of, these are North Korean missiles. What if they test a missile and instead of going over Tokyo, it lands in Tokyo accidentally? You could have an entire war start just because the other side miscalculated. So these are serious contingencies that the military has to prepare the president for.
I actually have the honor of. Sorry, I just wanted to say quickly, I went to
Jessica.
Japan for the first time over the summer and went to Hiroshima. So now seeing, the other side of what can happen when something like this breaks out, and the devastation, seeing it, face to face and going through that memorial, which I would recommend everybody does, and obviously hearing the responses to President Obama's visit, which was legendary.